Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. Zuhdi Jasser, pleasure to see you.
It's great to be back with you, Mark.
Zuhdi Jasser, you're a medical doctor.
Yes, sir.
You practice in the private sector. You founded and are president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. You're a first-generation American Muslim. Your parents fled the oppressive Ba'ath regime of Syria in the mid-1960s for American freedom. You're a patriot. You earned your medical degree on a U.S. Navy scholarship at the Medical College of Wisconsin in 1992. You served 11 years as a medical officer in the United States Navy. And you're the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Now, the reason I wanted to have you tonight is not only because you're a superb expert on this whole issue, not just of Islam and geopolitics and so forth, because it's very quiet right now. And when it's very quiet, I get very nervous, particularly when it comes to our enemies. And while we're focused, rightly so, on North Korea and some of these other challenges that we have in this country, Al-Qaeda's not quiet, ISIS isn't quiet, Hamas isn't quiet, Hezbollah isn't quiet, the Muslim Brotherhood's not quiet. They're all operating, they're all plotting their next attack on our allies and the next attack on this country. And what happens is people say, well, why weren't we talking about this? Why weren't we thinking about this? Why weren't we ready? So I want to talk about it. But let's start at the beginning. Sharia law. What is Sharia law?
Mark, it's great to be with you. And, you know, the Sharia is Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence. And one of the reasons my parents escaped Syria and came here was they viewed the American experiment, the American laboratory, about the ability for individuals to define their faith, define which of the laws in their faith they'll accept or reject, as being the type of society, the type of nation they wanted to belong to. So they rejected their Syrian nationalism, which was failed and has now continues to prove to be one of the worst tyrannies in the world, to come to embrace an Islam that was their own making, their own practice. So Sharia is the Islamic jurisprudence that is the laws that have evolved from 7th century Islam. So I would be deceptive or lying to you if I said Sharia was compatible with American law. My Sharia is the Islam of American patriots that I know that are Muslims that reject political Islam is, but the Sharia of Saudi Arabia, of the Pakistani Islamic law, of Egyptian law, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Hamas, those Sharia theocracies are incompatible with American law. So ultimately, now as we're finishing our holiest month of Ramadan, we just finished it, it's our holiday this weekend, my personal Sharia tells me how to pray, how to fast, how to follow my personal pietistic laws. But then there's Sharia that gets involved in criminal law, that gets involved in prohibiting speech. In governance. In punishments, in the inequality of men and women, the torture of dissidents, and all these other things that are done under the name of Sharia in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and other theocracies or quasi-theocracies. So as Americans try to get their head around what is Sharia, I would tell you, look at our own history. America was founded on a rejection of theocracy. Islam is in that time in its history right now. We're basically in the 16th, 17th century of what Christendom was in at that time. And right now, as it's quiet, as you said, the Muslim world is not quiet. The Iranian people are revolting in the streets in the thousands against their theocracy. My family in Damascus and Aleppo are dodging chemical weapons and helicopter gunships and a genocide from the Syrians, from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Russia. The Muslim Brotherhood is growing. ISIS may have been decimated in Syria, but jihadism, global Salafi jihadism, which is this ideology of anti-Westernism, of theocracy, is growing faster than it ever has.
Do you think the American media, the American media chases shiny objects, pretty much. Do you think the American media is substantive enough to understand that these threats remain out there, because they do a very poor job of covering them?
Well, I think, the honest portions of the American media, whether it be conservatives like yourself or others that are willing to talk to Muslims with a tough love, I think are addressing the issue. I think we've seen, like our organization and our Muslim Reform Movement leaders have shifted the needle, where after 9/11 no one would talk about Islamism and Islamists, and now we're starting to see a conversation where we recognize that it's not just terrorism. I mean, I'm a doctor, as you said, and I treat disease, I don't treat symptoms. And the disease of what we're facing is not just terrorism, that's a symptom. That's a whack-a-mole program. The disease is political Islam, Sharia states. The concept that our identity as Muslims is wedded to a national identity of Islamic governance. So there may be many Muslims in America that are here that reject sort of secular society. So the American media, and I think especially on the left now, if you get away from their 95% Trump derangement syndrome, where they're focused too much on completely ignoring the global issues that are continuing to evolve, the rest, because of the influence of foreign governments, Islamic states, and their funding of think tanks, especially on the left, the Clinton Foundation and their money from Qatar and the Saudis and others, and we see also this problem on the right, we are unable to have a honest conversation about the influence of Islamic movements and Sharia-type movements in our country and the influence on changing the narrative. And until we look at that problem and fix it, we're never going to treat the disease.
It's a problem I want to get to in just a second. You talked about the founding of America. John Locke, the Enlightenment, religions most have gone through this Reformation period. So there isn't this conflict between the Enlightenment and people of faith and religion. You're saying not so with a lot of the Muslim world. In the United States, we have this First Amendment. It's really quite brilliant. The free exercise of religion, but no establishment of religion. And it was based on, like much of the Constitution, Judeo-Christian concepts. But not just that. Aristotle, Cicero. Cicero wasn't a Christian, per se. I mean, it was the Romans who killed Christ. Mm-hmm. And yet, so basically our First Amendment says, look, if you're not out to destroy the Constitution, you know, if you're not ideologically driven to eviscerate this society, then have at it. You can be an atheist, you can be a Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, whatever you want. Isn't that the genius of the First Amendment? Absolutely, and I have to tell you, this is why America, and American Muslims especially, have a responsibility by being blessed. If I had grown up in Syria or Saudi Arabia, I would not be the man who sits before you today, respecting and learning from authors like yourself and having the opportunity to be on Life, Liberty, and Levin and talk about freedom, right? I would be a different consciousness because I'd be fighting for my freedom in Syria. I probably wouldn't be alive today. Or if I lived in Saudi Arabia, I would have been influenced by more anti-Western conspiracy theories, etc. So America needs to get out, especially the left, needs to get out of its ethnocentrism and obsession with what's happening in Washington and Hollywood and start looking at the world and saying, you know what, a quarter of the world's population is Muslim. It's a 1,400-plus-year-old religion that now is going through a time in history in which it's beginning to move against dictatorships and against theocracy. We can take sides in that, or we can continue to work with just a strong horse and pretend that somehow through a bigotry of low expectations that Arabs and Persians and Muslims in general want to be run by dictators and theocrats, and that could not be further from the truth. Every human being wants to be free. And people say, well, Islam needs a Martin Luther. You hit the nail on the head. It's too early for a Martin Luther yet. We need a John Locke, James Madison. We need Jeffersonian religious freedom papers to begin to start to teach our youth. I mean, one of the things I teach my 3 young children is the only thing I would ever want to die for, and this is the reason I joined the Navy, is America and our Constitution. I was taught by my parents that while we love and pray to God and we read our scripture in the Arabic Quran, I'd never want to die for that because God doesn't need me to die for him. And Zuhdi Jasser, I want to get to this group CAIR in a moment. But thinking about what you said, if the American media is so objectionable to a discussion about Islam, how do we expect the foreign media, much of which is state-controlled in these other countries, to even consider discussing reformation in Islam and so forth?
They become basically tools of foreign media, because let me give you an example. When President Trump decided to withdraw from the Iran deal, CNN, back hour after hour, started to show demonstrations in Iran and how this was making unrest. They were basically showing exactly what Iranian state media wanted them to show, which is the staged rallies that were happening, the burning of the flag and other things, which is what our enemies want. So at the end of the day, our media, when it doesn't have a compass about constitutional principles and about universal human rights, now all of a sudden we're hearing about that with North Korea, when in fact when Obama was selling the farm to Iran and handing them billions to do genocide in Syria and propagate terrorism around the world, nobody talked about human rights. But now all of a sudden they're doing it because to them the axis of their ideas is all about how to get the right and how to demonize everyone who is against their party, when in fact it's not about principles. So I hope ultimately, as we've proven in the last election, the American people are not stupid. They understand what the realities are, who to trust and who not to, and the left is going to continue to wither on the vine of false narratives, because a candidate who was elected by fighting the establishment, which is, I know what we're going to talk about with CAIR, the establishment in the Muslim community is evil, is theocratic, and are not friends of America.
Well, let's go there. This organization, CAIR, was established in a meeting in Philadelphia, wasn't it? Give us a little bit of history, because CAIR shows up everywhere. In the Obama administration, it showed up at the Department of Justice, it showed up at the White House, it showed up at the Defense Department. It's frequently referred to as the leading Muslim civil rights group in America. That's self-proclaimed and regurgitated by the media. They show up constantly on MSNBC and CNN and so forth. What do we know about CAIR?
You know, they're CAIR. I prefer to call them pejoratively the Council on American Islamist Radicalization, because that is really what they do. Is they are a offshoot. You know, basically the Islamic organizations in America started in the late 60s with the Muslim Student Association, fed by Saudi funding and also by Muslim Brotherhood immigration into the United States. And that evolved into some major organizations like the Islamic Society of North America, the Council on American Islamic Relations, your alphabet soup of basically Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups. And in '91, this is part of the FBI Holy Land Foundation trial in 2007, documents that were shown to be real documents from '91. They had an authoritative memorandum that said that they had certain organizations that are part of the evangelical movement of the Islamist movement to try to shape Western opinion, shape Western policy so that it favors Islamist interests, and CAIR is one of those groups. CAIR actually evolved from a group called the Islamic Association for Palestine. They found that the Palestinians weren't enough for their constituency, so they broadened it to hijack the Islamic community as part of the Palestinian movement, and some of my friends call them sort of Hamas on K Street.
Hamas on K Street, because they have ties to Hamas, don't they?
They do. Their founders have been linked to them. And at the end of the day, don't take my word for it, see how much they say against Hamas. When Hamas launches missiles into schools, when America starts saying we're going to stop funding to Hamas, which we should never have been doing to start with, which is helping what appears to be social and medical programs that end up actually getting money into Hamas's coffers, they start protesting. So at the end of the day, CAIR reveals its stripes by who it supports, and its anti-Semitism, its promotion of the BDS. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the Argentinians had to pull out of a soccer match in Jerusalem because the BDS movement ended up terrorizing them.
What's the BDS movement?
BDS is the boycott, divest movement that basically is trying to globally oppress the free markets of Israel by telling companies to divest from investment in Israel. And it basically reveals that they're trying to use all of the economic power of Islamic regimes, from Turkey to Saudi Arabia to the Palestinians and others, to try to put pressure on Israel. And I think Americans, this is another thing we're missing, is that it is a front for anti-Semitism and Islamic movements that we need to stand by our ally Israel and push back against.
This anti-Semitism you bring up, it's spreading in America, isn't it? On college campuses, universities, and Do you think these organizations, these Islamic organizations or Palestinian organizations, do you think they're promoting this sort of an attitude?
They are, because they come across as being the only voice of Muslims. But I'll tell you, that's changing. I mean, from when you and I started talking after 9/11, today, I just spoke at Duke a couple months ago. And, you know, for days, the Students Association were protesting me coming in. I was being brought in by a number of the freedom-based organizations, college Republicans and others. And they simply pushed back and said, oh, because the title of my talk was American Muslim Identity, Patriots or Insurgents. They said, oh, that's demonization, there's no binary, and the Muslim students protested, they had a sit-in, etc. But then after I gave my speech about how much I love my faith and how much it's patriotic to push back against Islamists, the coverage from the student newspaper was actually pretty positive, even though it was horrifically negative before I got in there. So all I can tell you is that when we're given a platform, they can't, at the end of the day, honestly call me an Islamophobe after they listen to what I say and the narrative of what I really believe in as a God-fearing, patriotic American Muslim who feels that our community globally has been hijacked by these political Islamist movements. And the universities, I think, is ground zero of this speech debate. As so many have seen, the Islamists and the left suppress free speech and create this climate where we can't even have an ability to disagree with one another because they call you a hater, a bigot, etc., and they shut down any type of critical thinking.
Why do you think the left, the Marxist left, the progressive left, the Islamist movement, as such as it is, why do you think they're so frequently on the same side of policy and political issues?
Because A, they're collectivists. They're both collectivists. And B, it's the shortcut of suppressing ideas that would defeat them. We've done debates against the imams where I've done Lincoln Douglas type debates at various universities. I did a debate against the Muslim Public Affairs Council last January about the necessity of the Muslim reform movement. And almost every Muslim that saw that debate said, you know what, now I understand what you guys believe. And I said, well, yeah, they're trying to present me without paying any attention to our message. So at the end of the day, the left, the Islamists are collectivists. This is why they work well with dictatorships, with socialists and others. It's all about collectivizing control of thought and preventing freedom, individual thought, and what really conservatism is all about.
So much for freedom of the press. You know, we have the press in this country, 90% of it, I think, is of a groupthink type, which you're talking about here. And they claim that they are defending the First Amendment and freedom of the press, when in fact, as you've also pointed out, they squelch and they suppress opinions that they personally do not agree with. We'll be right back. Zuhdi Jasser, President of the United States, nominates Pompeo to be Secretary of State. He soon thereafter appoints John Bolton to be his national security advisor. He appoints as Bolton's chief of staff a fellow by the name of Fred Fleitz, who's used to work at the CIA and so forth. And a variety of Muslim organizations, including CAIR, attacks every one of those appointments. In fact, they demand that Fleitz be removed. They worked over Congress on Pompeo. They have a special disdain for Bolton. What's that all about?
I have to tell you, I was seeing patients in my office and somebody was watching C-SPAN and saw Senator Murphy start to talk about how upset he was that Pompeo was nominated. Murphy, from the floor of the Senate, said, there are organizations as bigoted as the American Islamic Forum for Democracy.
Your group.
My group. And my patients are like, what are they talking about? And the senator clearly just read off a sheet that the Council on American Islamic Relations and other lobbyists in his office gave him to read. And that same, then his testimony was, then you could find it on Iranian Press TV, on Al Jazeera. So
the senator from Connecticut, his comments on the Senate floor were spread throughout these fascistic regimes.
Exactly. Why? Because he's criticizing our Secretary of State appointee, a Secretary of State, by the way, who, when he was Congressman Pompeo, did, I think, one of the most I think, pro-Muslim things, which was in his district, protest a Hamas fire-breathing imam and say that that mosque in his district should push back and not allow that anti-Semitic hate, anti-American stuff come from a religious facility in their district. And I wrote in support, worked closely with Congressman Pompeo's office to craft that pro-Muslim belief that we have diversity.
Is that why he was targeted?
Exactly. I think he's targeted because he's a threat to the establishment in the Islamic community, not a threat to Muslims. I think he's a benefit, a blessing to Muslims who are believers in liberty and life and freedom. But he's a threat to the Islamist establishment. And I think what's amazing to me is how dishonest folks like Senator Murphy are. We asked him, we demanded an apology. He slandered and libeled us from the floor of the Senate. I'm a patriotic, God-fearing Muslim who loves my faith. We are not bigoted or anti-Islam. He's doing the bidding of the Iranian Khomeinist by saying that. But at the end of the day, Mark, it's about diversity. How can a left, a senator like Murphy, who believes in diversity, then say that an American Islamic Forum for Democracy, or Ezra Nomani, who is a Wall Street Journal, used to be, now is a freelance reporter, is one of the co-founders of our Muslim Reform Movement, Rahil Raza, Majid Nawaz, all these leaders in our reform movement, most of whom are actually left of center. I'm right of center. We're a diverse organization. But how can he say that we are not Muslims or somehow we don't represent Muslim ideas? They ignore it. And if they really believed in diversity, to them diversity is all about racial diversity, ethnic diversity. They don't care about ideological diversity, which is what the left is about ideological oppression. If they cared about ideological diversity, they'd welcome our voices, pro-feminism, pro-freedom, into their understanding of Islam.
So when the senator smears you, and he's protected under the Constitution, they all are, the speech and debate clause, do you think what he said about you and your organization was bigoted?
I do. It is a bigotry of low expectations, where to them, the only people that should speak for Islam are the mullahs in robes, or the king of Saudi Arabia, or the Khomeinists in Iran, or the CAIRs that have their buildings owned by foreign countries, or the Muslim Student Association.
Do you see the Democrat Party more and more moving in that direction?
I do. I see them looking at political expediency rather than principles of our founding fathers and what this country is about. And I really, actually, I'm not trying to change their ideas. If they truly believed in diversity, they would be asking, you know, they look at people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a victim of female genital mutilation, who's spoken out for women's rights, and they call her a bigot. The scam that is the SPLC targets Muslims.
Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah, the Southern Poverty Law Center supposedly speaks out against bigotry, when in fact Majid Nawaz, who's part of our reform movement, had to sue them, and then all of a sudden their anti-jihad bigotry paper disappears from their website because their lawyers probably told them, you know what, you're targeting Muslims in that, and sort of exposing the fact that it's a scam. It's not about bigotry, it's simply a tool.
Are most of your battles with the institutional left, the media left, the left in the Democrat Party, most of your battles in this Islam reform movement with the left?
It is, the vast majority of them. And I think we need to lob it over them. I think we sometimes give the CAIRs of the world and the Islamists and the left a little too much credibility and too much attention. We can lob it over them because the Muslims in the streets of Iran are thanking President Trump for withdrawing from the Iran deal. The dissidents in the prisons of Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria and Turkey are applauding the fact that now there's a president and a leadership in America who's ignoring the identity politic, and they realize that Islam is not a race, it's a diverse ideology that needs to begin to have other dissident voices heard.
It's very interesting you should say this, because about a month ago I was in Israel when they moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And the Israelis love President Trump. And there were posters all over the country for President Trump. And when I returned to the United States, none of that was presented in the American media. None of it. Instead, the Israelis and the IDF were being accused of murdering Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, because Hamas, which, as you pointed out, controls the Gaza Strip, and was rushing the fence with 30, 40, 50,000 people, and they're very brave. You know, for them, it's men and women first. It's women and children first. And so the Israelis were trying to defend their border, but the American media had it completely the opposite way. It is very interesting to me who they point out as the heroes. Barack Obama, the great Barack Obama, sat on his hand for 10 days when the people of Iran were rising up. The great Barack Obama with his red line while the Syrians were being killed with chemical weapons, all kinds of destruction, and so forth and so on. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Zuhdi Jasser. The Iran deal, such as it, we still don't know everything that was in this Iran deal with all these secret side deals, but we do know that what the Iran deal did is take all the sanctions that the Bush administration had placed on Iran, which were crushing its economy, destroying its currency, pretty much on the brink. You have the people of Iran rise up for over a week. And then we get to a point where President Obama and John Kerry negotiate this deal with the Europeans and the Iranians and the Russians. $150 billion flows into this country, not to mention $1.7 billion in ransom money. And the controls of what Iran's going to do are either nebulous or really non-existent. And Iran is guaranteed to have nukes in a decade. The president is universally criticized in Europe, almost universally criticized by the American media. What do you make of this?
I don't get it. And I can tell you, having spoken to hundreds of Syrian Americans, and many of whom are Democrats who voted for Obama, would never do so again. They were so upset at how at the altar of the Iran deal, we handed over everything. We abandoned our allies from the 20th century, which are the Sunni governments of Saudi Arabia, of Egypt, etc. We then also handed them money that we lied to the Iranian people, where Obama in videos was telling the Iranian people that this money will help their economy. And this year, in January 1st, when the revolution restarted again, this green revolution, this time it's not just in Tehran. The revolution was happening in front of the theocratic teaching centers in Qom and other cities of Iran where the clerics are taught. That's what's amazing about this latest revolution in 2018. That started way before we pulled out. So the Iranian people in that revolution were holding signs saying that, stop sending money to Syria to kill Syrians. We need it here in this country. So we handed them money to spend more on short and long, mid-range missiles, to fund Hezbollah, to spread global terror. We abandoned many operations globally to try to get to Hezbollah at the altar of the nuclear deal. We then allowed companies to come into Tehran and begin to open up shop, like Boeing and other European companies, which never works to bring down a regime, actually helps to strengthen them. And as the sanctions ended, the Khomeinists were becoming even more belligerent. So at the end of the day, we got nothing in return, no even assurance of their nuclear disarmamentation. At the end of the day, we were more insecure. And now within months of us pulling out of the deal, the Iranian people are starting to see their economy weaken, which is actually helping them destabilize their government, and they actually see a light at the end of the tunnel. They're extremely thankful. The people of Iran, who we would share our values with, are thankful of what President Trump, John Bolton, and others have done now. And I think there is no, I don't know what planet the left is living on and thinking that somehow that was wise. I think we're proving now that the best anti-nuclear program would be to destabilize that regime and hopefully have a revolution to bring forth more democracy.
This civil war, it's more than a civil war. These battles in Syria, these taking place, has really exposed Turkey, hasn't it? And Erdogan, who has become a fascist. Still an American ally, apparently.
He's always been. Erdogan, when he even was running back in early 2000s, said, democracy is a train. You use it until you get to where you want to go, and then you get off. He is a cultish leader of a neo-caliphate that he wants to establish hegemony on. America should really look at suspending them from NATO. He is using language against the European nations where If Austria decides to shut down a few mosques, he basically starts using war language against them. If the Danish decide to outlaw the burqa, he then is starting to belligerently talk against them. So this is a country that we supposedly have a treaty with in NATO, and yet he's using language, hegemonic language about Islamic supremacy, while our families in Syria, if we want to blame, other than blaming the Assad regime, Iran and Russia, any country that radicalized the Syrian revolution was Qatar and Turkey especially.
And very briefly, and he's cozying up with Russia, getting weapons from Russia,
yep.
now, isn't he?
His latest shipment of missiles were from Russia because he said, well, the Europeans and the West are becoming antagonistic, so I'm going to go to Russia. This guy, the NATO treaty means nothing to him. So if you want to contain him, Americans need to wake up that while we're obsessed with whatever the media in Washington and New York are obsessed with.
Daniels and so forth.
It is horrifically negligent for us to ignore what's happening in Turkey with Erdogan. While the biggest mosque opened in America today in the last few years, now the largest mosque is in Maryland, which is a Diniyet outpost of the Turkish government.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll watch us also on Levin TV. Levin TV, you can catch us on CRTV.com. Give us a call at 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV. Sign up with our wonderful conservative community over there. We'll be right back. The president has been trashed from early on when he wanted to put in place immigration rules that limited, at least for a period of time, individuals coming into this country, refugees, from certain countries. And even federal judges, many of whom were appointed by Barack Obama, accused him, essentially, of being anti-Muslim. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely not. I mean, to hold a president accountable to words he may have said in his campaign, I might have disagreed with his word choice of how he expressed things. Bottom line is his policy today. It is absurd to say, I mean, I'm the fruit of Muslim immigrants that came here to practice their faith, so I believe that at the core of Americanism is a pro-immigration sense, but it is un-American to say that we should have lotteries or that we should have chain migration. I don't understand that. Americans who want to be, people who want to be Americans should be welcomed based on ideology. Communists, Islamists, collectivists who don't believe in our American constitutional law should not be allowed in. So an Islamist ban is very appropriate. And the previous administration, not only Obama, but the Bush administration also, have never really articulated how we vet refugees.
Is an Islamist ban a Muslim ban?
No. While all Islamists are Muslim, certainly not all Muslims are Islamists. And if anyone should be able to get this, Mark, it's Americans. We were founded by Christians who did not want to be theocrats or Christianists. So Islamists are certainly a large plurality among the Muslim population, but they're certainly not a majority. And if they're Islamists, then let them go to Saudi Arabia, let them go to other countries. They don't need to come to America and destabilize who we are as a country because we're just going to welcome people willy-nilly, regardless of their ideology.
And those 6 countries, they don't even come close to making up the majority of Muslims in the world. In fact, the largest Muslim countries weren't even included.
Yeah, 56 countries have Muslim majorities. And to say that that's a Muslim ban is just absurd, and it's insulting to Muslims. It's insulting to the Muslims in prisons in those countries. Many of the folks who get out are actually sent by their regimes to infiltrate, as the Turks do, in their policies, if you will. So I think there's nothing more pro-Muslim than saying, you know what, if you believe in the Western narrative of freedom and liberty, welcome to the West. If you don't believe in our way of secular liberal democracy, then you're not welcome here.
And by the way, that's the way it used to be across the board. We'll be right back. My final question to you, Zuhdi Jasser. What can be done with the left's ideological hold on the narrative about Islam?
I think, look at how President Trump came to where he is today. He's a disruptor who fought against the establishment and now is taking the offense in destroying ISIS and pushing back against the Khomeinists and others. So I would ask the American people and President Trump to take the offense, to embrace disruption, embrace some chaos in the Middle East. As bad as that might sound, revolutions are good, not the ones with Islamists winning, but the ones with those who share our values. The president talked about a commission on radical Islam in his campaign. It's time to convene that. It's time to no longer just have iftar dinners that bring in ambassadors or that bring in Islamists, which thankfully he didn't do this year, but bring in almost a freedom forum into the White House of Muslim dissidents of our Muslim reform movement to say, these are the Muslim side who we want to take. There's nothing more pro-diversity, pro-American than embracing Muslims that reject theocracy, and we're going to let them stand on our shoulders as Americans and show that we're pro-Muslim but anti-Islamist.
So embrace the freedom fighters, as we always have, even those who fought communism and fascism and so forth. Do the same with Muslims. Thank you very much. Very, very important.
Thank you.
See you next time on Life, Liberty, and Levin.